Good morning, everyone. And so we are back to doing online sessions. And if you can hear my voice clearly, can you raise your hand? If not, please let me know via the chat. Okay, so let's continue with the tutorial 3 that we did for currency swaps. For swaps. So where we looked at interest rate swaps and the currency swaps. So we looked at how swaps can be used in order to transform or to change the nature of a liability and also to change the nature of an asset. So far in the tutorial, we looked at how interest rate swaps can be used to convert a fixed rate loan or fixed rate liability to a floating rate liability and vice versa, or a fixed rate investment to a floating rate investment, vice versa. So let's continue from question number 4 onwards. So question number 4 and 5, the remaining 2 questions, they are based on currency swaps. So under currency swaps, what we are going to do is, as I have told you before, what we're going to do is we're going to change or we are going to convert a liability in one currency to a liability in another currency. Or we can convert an investment or an asset in one currency to an asset in another currency. So can you read question number 4 and attempt to do it? So if you look at question number 4, okay, in question number 4, it says, Company X wishes to borrow US dollars at a fixed rate of interest. So if you consider the two companies, X and Y, if you consider these two companies, first look at what is the requirement of these two companies. What do they prefer? What do they want? So first look at that. So it says company X wishes to borrow US dollars. So they want a loan in US dollars and at a fixed rate of interest. And if you look at company Y, it wishes to borrow Japanese yen at a fixed rate of interest. So here, both of these liabilities, they want both of their liabilities as fixed rate loans. So this type of swap we call it. So this is simply we are changing the currency. We are converting only the currency here, not the interest rate. We are not converting a fixed rate loan to a floating rate loan or a floating rate to a fixed. So this type of swap we refer as a fixed for fixed currency swap. So we call this type of swap as a fixed for fixed currency swap. So in here, similar to what we did earlier, right? Similar to what we did earlier, look at the requirements. So Y wants a borrowing in yen, Japanese, sorry. Y wants, company Y would require a borrowing in Japanese yen. And then identify, so if you read on the question, it says, the amounts required by the two companies are roughly the same at the current exchange rate, and the companies are subject to the following interest rates, which have been adjusted to reflect the impact of taxes. So here you have been given the interest rate after accounting for any differences in the taxes, because when you borrow from another currency, another country, you can be subject to different tax rates. So because of that, after accounting for all these tax differentials, they have given what is the interest cost for company X in yen and dollars, and company Y in the yen market and also in the dollar market as well. And the requirement is, it asks you to design a swap that will net a bank acting as an intermediary 50 basis points per annum. So this 50 basis points will be the charge or that is the fee that is required by the financial intermediary. So here when they say 50 basis points, always remember 1 basis point. 1 basis point will be equal to 0.01. It will be 0.01%, right? 1 basis point is 0.01%. So if that's the case, if that is the case, then 50 basis points is how much? How much would be 50 basis points? Can you reply in the chat? If 1 basis point is 0.01%, how much is 50 basis points? So as a percentage, what is the charge of the financial intermediary? Yes, so it would be 0.5%. So this will be the charge of the financial intermediary in facilitating this swap arrangement. And then if you look at, it asks you to make the swap equally attractive. So you have to make this equally attractive to both parties, that is for company X and for company Y, and ensure that all foreign exchange risk is assumed by the bank. So when we do the question, when we answer this, I will explain what is meant by this part. What is meant by the financial intermediary assuming all the foreign exchange risk. So I will explain that with the answer when we do the question, when we answer the question. So you know, when you do a swap question, first you have to identify whether there is any need for swap, whether there is any basis for swap. So to identify that, you need to identify what is the market in which that each of the companies has a comparative advantage. So in which market X has a comparative advantage, and in which market Y has a comparative advantage. So if you look at the difference here, if you look at the difference between the interest rates that are offered or that are given in the yen market for X and Y, and that are given in the dollar market for X and Y. So here the difference is you have 1.5%. Interest rate difference is there. The difference between 5% and 6.5%. So that will give you 1.5% difference. And then here, if you look at what is the difference? The difference between 10% and 9.6%, which will give you 0.4%. So this is the interest rate difference in these markets for both of these companies. So one of the students is asking as to how I got 1 basis point as equal to 0.01. So this is a measurement that is used. Okay. So in here, so always 1 basis point it's a standard. So 1 basis point is equal to 0.01%. So rather than saying 0.01%, you can give it in basis points, right? So that's a measurement unit that is used. So if you use 1 basis points, that is equivalent to 0.01%. So that's why I took, if you have 50 basis points, if the financial intermediary charges 50 basis points, if the question is given in that manner, then if you convert it as a percentage, it would be 0.5%. Okay, I hope that is clear. And then moving on. So here we looked at, okay, what is the difference between the interest rates? So here in the yen market, you have 1.5% difference and 0.4% difference in the dollar market. So let's take company X first. So can you all tell me in which market company X has a comparative advantage? So if you look at these interest rate differentials, so this is a liability that we are looking at. So when we are looking at a liability, always lower the better. So yes, so as you have mentioned, if you take in the yen market, X is paying 1.5% less. But in the dollar market, X is paying only 0.4% less. So because of that, if you compare these two markets for X, X has a comparative advantage, or X is more beneficial or more benefited in the yen market. So because of that, you can say for company X, X will have a comparative advantage in the yen market. And if you look at for Y, then for Y, it would be, if you look at the rates, what can you say? For Y, in which market Y has a comparative advantage? Yes, so if you look at Y, so how would you interpret? Y in the yen market pays 1.5% more than X, but in the dollar market, it is paying only 0.4% more. So that means for Y, in the dollar market, Y will have a comparative advantage because Y is better off in the dollar market. It is paying only 0.4% more than X in the dollar market. So because of that, you can say for Y, the comparative advantage will be in the US dollar market. So now if you look at here, this situation, this scenario, this condition creates a basis for swap, because while X has a comparative advantage in the yen market, but what X requires is a liability or a loan in the US dollars, But if you take Y, Y has a comparative advantage in the US dollar market, but Y requires is yen. So this creates the basis for swap. Then what you can do is you can look at what is the net gain that you can get from this swap agreement, swap arrangement. From the swap arrangement, what is the total gain that you can expect? So how much is the total gain that you can expect from the swap arrangement? How much would it be? So it would be, in fact, the difference between these two interest rate differentials. Okay. So if you take 1.5% minus 0.4%, so that you can expect a net gain of 1.1%. But the issue is, though you can expect a 1.1% gain from this swap arrangement, there is a financial intermediary who is charging 0.5%. So because of that, you will have to deduct the charge of the financial intermediary as well. Then look at what is the gain or the benefit that is remaining to X and Y. So the benefit remaining to X and Y would be then how much? It would be 0.6%. Okay, so it would be 0.6% over here. So this is the benefit that is remaining for X and Y after making the payment for the financial intermediary. And also in the swap, in the question, if you look at here, it says we need to make the swap equally attractive for both X and Y. So if you need to make it equally attractive, what do we have to do? We have to divide this benefit equally among X and Y. So you will have to divide this equally. So 0.6% should be equally divided among X and Y. If that's the case, X will get a benefit of 0.3% and Y will get a benefit of 0.3% as well. So these are the benefits that X and Y will get from this swap agreement. And the next step is to identify what is the cost, ultimate cost through the swap. So after you consider the swap, what would be the ultimate cost for X and Y? So to identify that, let's take X first. So if you take X, so you know X required a borrowing in US dollars. If X went to the US dollar market and borrowed from the US dollar market directly, the cost to X is how much? The cost to X would be 9.6%. So if it goes directly to the US dollar market, X will have to incur a cost of 9.6%. But through this swap, X is getting an advantage. There is a benefit that X is getting of 0.3%. So because of this benefit, the cost of X should be reduced by this 0.3%. So the ultimate cost to X after the swap. So after the swap, the ultimate cost to X should be 9.6% minus 0.3%, so that it will give you 9.3%. And then look at for Y. So this is for X. Next, consider Y. If you consider Y, what would be the ultimate cost, the final cost for Y after you do the swap, or after the swap arrangement, after you do the swap, what is the ultimate cost? So Y, if Y wants to borrow in yen. So if Y goes to the yen market and borrows directly from the yen market, the cost to Y would be 6.5. So if it goes directly to the yen market. But this cost now will be reduced because of the swap. Why? Because through the swap, Y is getting a benefit of 0.3%. So the cost for Y should be reduced by 0.3% benefit that Y is getting from the swap. So the ultimate cost to Y should be 6.2%, which is 6.5% minus 0.3%, so that the ultimate cost is 6.2%. And now design the swap. So because you know that the cost to X should be 9.3% and the cost to Y should be 6.2%. But this 9.3 over here, if you look at for X, we're looking at 9.3% on a US dollar borrowing, right? On the US dollar borrowing, X would be paying 9.3%. For Y also, Y prefers yen. So because of that, this 6.2% should be on a yen borrowing. So this should be a cost in yen. So for X, this should be a cost in US dollars. So let's look at how to design the swap. So here we need to consider three parties. What are the three parties? We have X, you will have Y, and also the financial intermediary as well. So here you can take X, and in here on the other side it would be Y, and in between you will have the financial intermediary facilitating this swap arrangement. So now if you take X, so when you're designing the swap, the currency swap, first look at, take one side and look at, let's first take X. Now X, we know, has a comparative advantage in the yen market. Since X has a comparative advantage in the yen market, what will X do? X would go and borrow from the yen market because it has a comparative advantage. It is more benefited. So it is better off in the yen market. So it will borrow from the yen market. So if X goes to the yen market, the cost then would be 5% on a yen borrowing. So to the outside party from whom X is borrowing, X would pay 5%, but this 5% would be a yen value on the yen amount, right? 5% in yen. And then if you look at Y, Y has a comparative advantage in the US dollar market. Because of that, Y will go and borrow from the US dollar market. So Y goes and borrows. If Y goes and borrows from the US dollar market, the cost would be 10%. So Y will pay 10% to the outside parties on the dollar amount, on a dollar amount that was borrowed, on US dollar amount, right? So that is the cost of Y to the outside party. The cost of Y that is paid to the outside party on the dollar amount. And next, when we are devising the currency swap, the easiest way is, first let's take X. So X is paying 5% on a yen amount. So we need to make sure in a currency swap, the easiest thing is to do is make sure that X gets this amount. Because why? X is paying 5% on a yen amount. So if X is getting this amount from the financial intermediary, X is not having any transaction in yen, right? So if X is getting 5% on the yen amount from the financial intermediary, then this cost of X will cancel off. So far, no cost to X. And then what should happen? So similarly to the other side also, so why we are eliminating this yen cost? Because for X, if you look at X preferred its cost to be in US dollars. X wanted its cost to be in US dollars. So that's why we are eliminating any yen cost to X. And if you take for Y also, if you look at from the Y's perspective, Y wanted its costs to be in yen. Y ඕන කළේ cost එක yen වලින්. But now what has happened? Y had an advantage in the dollar market. So Y borrowed in dollars. So far the cost is in dollars. So if we make sure that Y receives this 10% on the dollar amount from the financial intermediary, 10% on the dollar amount from the financial intermediary. So now again, we are eliminating the dollar cost to Y. But we know the ultimate cost, the final cost to X should be how much? It should be a dollar cost of 9.3% for X. X the antima final cost after the swap, it should be 9.3% in dollars. So far now for X, the cost is 0. Why? X is paying 5% on a yen amount to the outside party. So this amount X is receiving from the financial intermediary. So now we can account for the cost of X. So we need to make sure that X pays this cost, 9.3% on the dollar amount to the financial intermediary. So if you look at from this side, the cost to X would have been only 9.3% on the dollar amount. Why? This, even though it is paying 5% on the yen, it is receiving this 5% on the yen from the financial intermediary. So ඉතුරුලා තියෙන එකම cost එක X with 9.3% on the dollar amount. So first adjust for each of these parties. So we have made the adjustment for X. Now do the adjustment for Y in a currency swap. So for Y, if you look at, so if you take for Y, Y is paying 10% on a dollar amount to the outside parties. And this same cost, this cost is received by Y from the financial intermediary. So now, so far there is no cost to Y in dollars, or there is no cost to Y. But we know after the swap, the cost of Y should be 6.2% on the yen value. So we can make sure that Y pays 6.2% on the yen value to the financial intermediary. So if you look at, in fact, the ultimate cost for Y has been now only 6.2% on the yen value, because this 10% Y is paying is received, Y is receiving this from the financial intermediary. So the ultimate cost is now only the final cost to Y is only this 6.2% on the end value. So we have adjusted the cost for X, we have adjusted the cost for Y. Yes, so now let's look at what has happened to the financial intermediary, because we know financial intermediary should get a benefit of, should get a return of 0.5%. So if you look at the net impact to the financial intermediary, you will observe that the net impact or the net return to the financial intermediary is in fact 0.5%. So first, in a currency swap, what I would suggest is do the adjustments for each of the parties involved in the swap, for X here and for Y. And then the adjustment for the financial intermediary, the return for the financial intermediary will get automatically adjusted. So let's look at the return of the financial intermediary in this case. So if you take the financial intermediary, let's look at the yen. In yen, the financial intermediary is receiving 6.2% from Y. And on the other hand, financial intermediary is paying 5% on the yen amount, right? To X. So in here, if you look at what is the return of the financial intermediary in yen, can you comment? It is receiving 6.2% from Y and it is paying 5% to X. It is receiving 6.2 from Y and it is paying 5% in yen to X. So what is the return in yen if you look at this flow on the top? So that would be 1.2%, right? In yen, the financial intermediary is getting a return of 1.2%. And then what about in dollars? So what is the return to the financial intermediary in dollars? So the financial intermediary is receiving 9.3% in dollars, but it is paying, the financial intermediary is paying 10% to Y. So it is a negative return, right? So it is paying more. So it is a cost rather than a return. So of minus, so the return is minus negative 0.7%. So if you ignore the currency values, what is as a percentage, what has been the net return to the financial intermediary now? So it is getting 1.2% on a yen amount in yen, and it is getting 0.7%. Oh, it is actually paying. There's a loss of 0.7% on the dollar amount. So the net impact is in fact a return of 0.5%. So this 0.5% return has been paid to the financial intermediary, but not in the same currency. This 0.5% return the financial intermediary has got from or in two different currency values. So because of this, we say that so the financial intermediary is exposed to two currencies. So it is exposed to the exchange rate risk. But if you take for X, X is having the cost in the currency it prefers. X ke cost එක X prefer කරපු currency එකෙන් තියෙනවා. Y ke cost එක Y prefer කරපු currency එකෙන් තියෙනවා. But if you take the financial intermediary is having its return in two different currencies. So it is subject to the fluctuations in Y, and also it is subject to the fluctuations in dollars. Not only to the fluctuations in one currency. So that's why we said that all of the foreign exchange risk will be assumed by the bank. So there are different ways in which that you can structure, you can arrange this swap, but this is one way that you do. So normally you follow this method when it says that all of the foreign exchange risk will be borne by the financial intermediary. So is it clear up to this point what I did so far? Okay, so, and now if you assume, okay, now I'm changing this a little bit, the question. So if I assume, so here in the question, I assumed that the financial intermediary bears the exchange rate risk. So now I'm making an assumption, I'm changing the question a little bit, and I'm saying Y agrees to bear the exchange rate risk. So if Y agrees to bear the exchange rate risk, right? If Y agrees to bear the exchange rate risk, how can you design the swap? Can you attempt it on your own? If Y agrees to bear the exchange rate risk, so if Y agrees to bear all of these exchange rate risk, then the cost of Y, what can you say? The cost of Y, this 9.3%, sorry, this 6.2% would be in two different currencies, not only in yen. If Y agrees to bear all of the exchange rate risk, මේ 6.2% cost එක white එන yen වලින් විතරක් නෙමෙයි තව dollar වලිනුත් මේ cost එක හැදෙනවා, right? So try to do it. So now if you look at from here, from the X perspective, if you take X into account, X will pay 5% on Y, on yen amount, and this 5%, we have to make sure X receives it. So now for X, there is no cost in yen. X yen වලින් cost එකක් නැහැ. So we are making X cost only in dollars. So in dollars, X will have a cost of 9.3%. So we are paying, X will pay 9.3% to financial intermediary. So here on this side of the swap that we designed, there will be no change on the side of X. But if you look at on the side of Y, so let's assume that a simple assumption that financial intermediary is it's operating in dollars. Its operating currency is in dollars. So now if that's the case, so the financial intermediary would want this 0.5% return. The 0.5% return එක financial intermediary ඕන වෙනවා තනිකර dollars වලින්. So that means this 0.5% return should be only in dollars. So it should have a return of 0.5% only in dollars, right? So here to have a 0.5% return only in dollars, so this from this 9.3% return, it is getting on the dollars, right? From this 9.3%, it will deduct 0.5% straight away. මේ හම්බෙන 9.3% වලින්ම මේ 0.5% charge කරගන්නවා. එතකොට අයිත් පැත්තට y ට හම්බෙන්නේ කීයක්ද? From 9.3%, if 0.5% is charged, how much would Y get? How much would Y would get? Y ට හම්බෙන්නේ කීයක්ද financial intermediary? In the chat. From 9.3%, 0.5% is charged. So if that's the case, on a dollar value, Y would get only 8.8%. Within 0.5%, okay, not 5%. So from 9.3%, deduct 0.5%, so that the return to the financial intermediary will be $0.5 only in 0.5% only in dollars, right? So that would be the return to the financial intermediary. So it will keep a 0.5% return and will transfer the balance to Y. So Y would get only a return of 8.8% in dollars. And then over here, what should happen? To pay this 5% yen amount, 5% in yen, the financial intermediary should receive this 5% from Y. Otherwise, the intermediary is again facing a risk. So intermediary is also not bearing the risk in this case. Y is bearing the risk. So if that's the case, so we know that financial intermediary has to pay 5% in yen to X. So the may amount එක pay කරන්න financial intermediary ට මේ amount එක කෙලින්ම Y ගෙන් hambenon. So that means Y should pay 5% in yen to the financial intermediary. So now let's look at, so if you look at X's cost is, company X cost is 9.3% in dollars. The financial intermediary's return is only 0.5% in dollars, because to make this yen, in yen there is no return. The cost is received by Y to the financial intermediary. So that it has its return only in dollars. What about Y now? So we know for Y, there is a cost of 5% in yen. Yen වලින් 5% cost එකක් තියෙනවා for Y. In yen, there is a cost of 5% to Y. And in dollars, not only that, in dollars also there is an additional cost. Why? Y is paying 10% to outside parties on dollar amount. But Y is receiving only 8.8% on the dollar amount. It is receiving only 8.8%. It is paying 10% to the outside party. So how much is the cost in dollars to Y? What is the cost to Y? Y ගේ cost එක මොකක්ද dollars වලින් ගත්තොත්? 10% outside parties වලට ගෙවනවා. You're paying 10% to outside parties and receiving 8.8% from the financial intermediary. If that's the case, yes, it would be one. Since we are looking at a cost, the cost එක කෙලින්ම අපි 1.2% positive value එකක් ගන්න. මොකද අපි මෙතන cost එක consider කරන්නේ. Not a return, right? Here I'm looking at a cost. So 5% cost in yen and 1.2% cost in dollars. So that the ultimate cost to Y is how much? 6.2%. So what we got over here. But what is the issue? Now the 6.2% cost is in two currencies. So Y wanted only yen. Y wanted only yen. But now Y has to bear a cost in dollars as well. So Y is exposed to the fluctuations in the dollar value. So based on the information that are given in the question, you can design the swap in different ways. And so when it says the foreign exchange risk is borne by the bank, do it in the way that we initially did it, right? Do it in the way how we did earlier in the previous case. And also normally in your questions, it is assumed that the bank will bear the foreign exchange risk, because otherwise normally the bank is in a better position to hedge the risk, right? A bank or the financial intermediary would be in a better position to hedge the risk. So because of that, the bank will bear this foreign exchange risk. So most of the cases it would be in this manner, where exchange rate risk will be borne by the bank. So when that is the case, do it in the way that we did earlier. So that's about this question number 4. So can you quickly do question number 5 as well? And in the meantime, if you have any questions related to this question number 4, you can ask via the chat. So I will give you a couple of minutes to read question number 5 and attempt it. So it's the same flow that we do, same process that we follow. So here one of the students is asking as to why we are receiving only 8.8% in this case though. So this under the assumption that I took, this is not This is not the answer for the question that is asked here, right? So this answer that I derived in the uh, 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 later, or the answer that I derived later, is based on the assumption that I took that Y bears all the foreign exchange risk. So in that case, so here I assume that even the financial intermediary wants its return only in dollars. So if that's the case, so from this 9.3% dollar return the financial intermediary is getting, it will charge its fee. Financial intermediary की charge එකේ 0.5%. එතකොට මේ 0.5% directly මේ dollar return එකෙන් එයා charge කරගන්නවා. එතකොට එයාගේ return එක වෙන්නේ only 0.5% dollars. So මේ එතකොට financial intermediary, if the financial intermediary keeps 0.5% dollars, what is the remaining balance? Remaining balance is only 8.8%. So this swap design I have arranged with the assumption, I'm telling you again, that Y will bear all the foreign exchange rate risk. I hope it's clear. 9.3% වලින් 0.5% අඩු කළාම ඔට එන්නේ 8.8%, right? No, actually, I have not shown. Yes, one of the students, as you can see, is asking why didn't we show the exchange of the principal amount? Actually, the principal will be exchanged in this case in a currency swap, but here we have only shown the exchange of the interest cost, right? The interest fee, only the interest fee. Normally, in an interest rate swap, the principal is not exchanged, but in a currency swap, the principal is exchanged. So how will the principal would flow in here? Now X, I do not have the previous design of the swap, but normally what happens here, X will get a borrowing in yen, right? X will have a borrowing in yen and Y will have a borrowing in US dollars. Why? X has a comparative advantage in yen and Y has a comparative advantage in US dollars. එතකොට Y borrow කරන්නේ, Y will borrow US dollars in US dollars and X will borrow in yen. But what they need is the opposite. So here, how will the principal flow? At the beginning of the swap, the principal would flow in the opposite direction of these arrows, right? So that means the yen amount, X is borrowing, X will give it to the financial intermediary. Because the yen borrow කරාම මෙතන arrow එක එන්නේ මොන පැත්තටද? The arrow will be flow to the other side. The arrow would flow to the other side, to this side. The yen borrowed principal amount would come to X and X would give this yen amount, the principal amount, to the financial intermediary. The financial intermediary would give this principal amount to Y and Y will get that yen amount that it needed. And if you look at the dollar amount then, Y would get the dollar amount that was borrowed, the principal dollar amount, and Y will give this principal dollar amount to the financial intermediary and financial intermediary will give the principal dollar amount to X. So always at the beginning of the swap, the principal amount will be exchanged in the opposite direction as indicated by the arrows. You can swap take a design karaddi, no need to show the principal amount here, but in a currency swap, the principal amount will be exchanged. Okay. The principal amount will be exchanged, but at the beginning in the opposite direction as indicated in the arrows. And at the end of the swap, the principal will be again exchanged in the same direction as indicated in the arrows. Because at the end of the swap, what happens? At the end of the swap, the liability has to be settled. X borrow kara Y in yen. So X borrowed in yen. So if X borrowed in yen, then at the end of the swap, X has to settle this yen amount. To settle this yen amount, X should get this yen amount from Y, right? Starting from Y. So I hope it is clear. right? The principal will be exchanged somehow. At the beginning in the opposite direction of the arrows, at the end of the swap in the same direction as indicated by the arrows. So let's look at question number 5. So in question number 5 also it is again a currency swap, but here it is not a fixed for fixed currency swap, because here you're converting even the interest rates, you're converting a fixed rate to a floating rate, and even a floating rate to a fixed. So not only the currency as well. So let's read the question. It says company A and B face the following interest rates, and again these rates have been adjusted for any differences in the tax, or for the tax impacts it has been adjusted. And assume that, so these are the rates given. So if you take company A and company B, I will write in this manner. So I have in dollars, in US dollar market, and in the Canadian dollar market. So if that's the case in USD. So here if you take for A, the dollar cost is LIBOR. I'm rewriting the information in this way because so far we did the calculation in this manner, right? So for A, the dollar cost is LIBOR plus 0.5%, and for B, the dollar cost is LIBOR plus 1%. So I'm simply rewriting for the ease of calculation. And then if you look at the Canadian dollars, for A, the cost is 5%. It's a fixed cost of 5%. And for B, it is 6.5%. So as the first step, look at the requirement. Look at whether there is any basis for swap. Look at the requirement and look at the comparative advantage for A and for B. So what is the requirement? It says, if you read the question, assume that A wants to borrow US dollars at a floating rate of interest. So A wants US dollars. So anyway, in the US market, it is a floating rate that is offered. So A wants US dollars. And B wants to borrow from the Canadian dollars, or to borrow from the Canadian dollar market at a fixed rate of interest. So B wants Canadian dollars. That is the requirement. A financial institution is planning to arrange a swap and requires 50 basis points spread. So again, the return to the financial intermediary should be how much? I told you 1 basis point is equal to 0.01%. If that's the case, how much is 50 basis points? 50, as in the previous case, it would be 0.5%. Like in the previous case, 50 basis points will reflect a return of 0.5% to the financial intermediary. If the swap is to appear equally attractive to A and B, again, if it is equally attractive, what should happen? Whatever the benefit that you are getting from the swap should be equally divided among A and B. So what rates of interest will A and B end up paying? So basically here, rather than designing the swap, I think you're required to calculate only the rate of interest that A and B would end up paying. So let's look at what is, in which market A and B has a comparative advantage. So let's look at the interest rate differential. In the US dollar market, the interest rate differential is only 0.5%. And in the Canadian dollar market, the interest rate differential is 1.5%. Now, in which market, you can reply in the chat, does A have a comparative advantage? For A, in which market A has a comparative advantage? Yes, A has a comparative advantage in the Canadian dollar market. Why? Because in US dollar market, it is paying only 0.5% less, but in the Canadian dollar market, it is paying 1.5% lesser. So that means it is better off in the Canadian dollar market. So A has a comparative advantage in the Canadian dollar market. And if you look at B, that would be the other way. So that is for B. B is paying 0.5% more in the US dollar market, but B is paying 1.5% more in the Canadian dollar market. So if that is the case, B is better off in the US dollar market for B. Why? B is paying, yes, it is anyway paying more compared to A in all the markets, but it is the difference is less. It is paying only 0.5% more than A in the US dollar market. So B is better off if it goes to the US dollar market. So for B, there will be a comparative advantage in the US market. So now based on this, you can say that there is a basis for swap. Because A has a comparative advantage in the Canadian dollar market, but A wants US borrowing, US dollar borrowing, but B has a comparative advantage in the US dollar market, but B wants a Canadian dollar borrowing. So let's look at what is the total gain you can expect from this swap. How much is the total gain? Without considering the fee to the financial intermediary, what is the total gain that you would get? So it would be the difference between these two, 1.5% and 0.5%. So you can expect a total gain of 1%. So out of this 1%, because the financial intermediary is facilitating the swap agreement, you will have to pay 0.5% to the financial intermediary. So what is remaining is, the benefit remaining is only 0.5% now. Because from 1%, 0.15% was paid to the financial intermediary. So the remaining benefit is 0.5%. So we want to make this equally attractive to both A and B. We want to make it equally attractive to both A and B. That means we have to equally divide this 0.5% among A and B. So that is 0.25% benefit should go to A. So we are equally dividing it among A and B. And 0.25% benefit should go to B. So now, based on this, you can identify what would be the final cost for A and B after or through this swap arrangement. So if you consider that, let's take A first. So if you take A first, you know that A wanted a US dollar borrowing. So if it goes to the US market and borrows directly from there, what is the cost? If A goes to the US dollar market, the cost is LIBOR plus 0.5%. So that is the cost of A, LIBOR plus 0.5% if it goes to the US dollar market directly. But now, rather than going directly, what they're trying to do is they're going to go for a swap where they can benefit. So from the swap, A is getting a 0.25% benefit. So the cost of A with the swap, the cost of A will be reduced by 0.25%. So now calculate how much would be the final cost to A. So the final cost to A would be LIBOR plus 0.25%. Then look at for B. So this would be your answer. For A, it would be LIBOR plus 0.25%. And then look at for B, what would be the final cost? If B goes, So B wants a Canadian dollar borrowing. So if B goes to the Canadian market and get a loan, then the cost to B would be 6.5%. So it would be 6.5% if it directly goes to the Canadian dollar market and borrows. But through the swap, there's a benefit of 0.25%. So the cost will be reduced by 0.25%. So the ultimate cost to B should be 6.25%. So this cost should be ideally for B, it should be in Canadian dollars because it prefers Canadian dollars. And for A, this cost should be in US dollars because it prefers US dollars. So these should be the final cost that A and B should end up paying through the swap. So though it is not required, can you quickly design the swap for this? So without considering the principal exchange, look at how the interest would be exchanged among these two parties. Try to do it. So here we have three parties. We have A, we have B, and also we have the financial intermediary. A is there, B, and the financial intermediary. So first look at what is the cost of these parties that is paid to the outside or third party from whom they are borrowing. So if you take A, we know A would borrow from the Canadian dollar market because it has a comparative advantage in the Canadian dollar market. So if A borrows from the Canadian dollar market, its cost would be 5% in Canadian dollars. So A would pay 5% in Canadian dollars to the outside party on the amount that was borrowed. But we know, and also the other thing is, now here in this case, it is not mentioned as to who will bear the exchange rate risk. So in such an instance, always assume it is the financial intermediary that will bear the exchange rate risk. So based on that assumption, design the swap. So here if you take A, the cost of A would be to the outside party 5% in Canadian dollars because it is borrowing Canadian dollars. A wants its cost to be in US dollars. So because of that, we want to eliminate this Canadian dollar cost. So to eliminate that, we have to make sure that A receives this cost. So A receives this 5% cost from the financial intermediary. And on the other side, so now we have eliminated the Canadian dollar cost of A. We know that with the swap, the cost of A should be LIBOR plus 0.25%, what we calculated over here in dollars. So you can say, so the cost is the amount that A should pay to the financial intermediary would be LIBOR plus $0.25 or 0.25% in dollars. LIBOR plus 0.25% in dollars. So that is the cost to A. So we have made the adjustment from the A side. And now look at from the B side. So if you look at from company B side, company B will borrow from the US dollar market because it has an advantage in that particular market. If B borrows from the dollar market, B goes to dollars, so its cost is LIBOR plus 1%. So that means B will pay LIBOR plus 1% to the outside party, and that cost will be in dollars, right? LIBOR plus 1% to the outside party, and where the cost would be in dollars, because B would borrow in US dollars. And in order to eliminate the dollar cost, of B, we have to make sure that B receives this dollar cost. So that is LIBOR plus 1% in dollars should be received by B from the financial intermediary. So now from the B side, the dollar cost is eliminated. And then also we know that the cost to B should be 6.25 in Canadian dollars. So we can make sure in the swap that B pays this cost, 6.25. This is the simplest way that you can devise this, okay? B pays 6.25% Canadian dollars to the financial intermediary, right? So here if you look at now what we have done from B side, we have eliminated the dollar cost of B, and we have made the cost of B equivalent to 6.25% in Canadian dollars. So we have made the adjustment from B side as well. Now check and see whether the return of the financial intermediary is 0.5%. 0.5%. So check and see. So let's look at in Canadian dollars. What is the return to the financial intermediary in Canadian dollars? Can you reply in the chat? The return to the financial intermediary in Canadian dollars. How much? Financial intermediary return එක Canadian dollars වලින් ගත්තොත්, look at the flow, the top one. So which is, yes, financial intermediary is receiving 6.25%, but it is paying only 5%. That means financial intermediary is keeping 1.25% with the financial intermediary. Then what about the dollar cost? So the dollar return. So I'm looking at the return here. So in Canadian dollars, the return to financial intermediary is 1.25. So in dollars, the return would be financial intermediary is receiving LIBOR plus 0.25%. But it is paying LIBOR plus 1%. It is paying 0.75% extra. So that means this dollar cost, the return in dollars would be minus 0.75. So if you look at, in fact, the return to the financial intermediary has been only 0.5%. But this return, the financial intermediary will get in two currencies, so that the financial intermediary is exposed to this exchange rate risk. So that is exposed to the fluctuations in these two currencies, so that it can think of hedging, right? So that's about question number 5. So is it clear? Did you all understand what I did over here? Can you raise your hand if you all did? And if you do have any questions with regard to this, you can ask via the chat. Okay. So now, since we are done with that, we can move on to next tutorial, which is tutorial 4. So that was also uploaded to the LMS. So can you take tutorial 4 and refer the first question in it. So basically this tutorial 4 is based on 2 lessons. That is based on the mechanics of options markets and the properties of stock options. So you have not yet completed the properties of stock options. But based on my understanding, you have done up to the put call parity. That means you have not done put call parity yet. And also there is another message from Nimasa as well. So tomorrow's lecture, the starting time will be informed to you within the day, right? So today, by the end of the day, we will inform you at what time tomorrow's lecture would start in the morning, because it will depend on the availability of Nimal sir. So based on his availability, we will communicate you at what time the lecture would start. So be alert on that. And so let's move on to tutorial 4. So attempt the first question in tutorial 4. I will give you a few minutes. So here in tutorial 4, I'm planning to do till question number 6. So let's try to do as much as possible. So try to attempt the first few questions. I will give you a couple of minutes. So under mechanics of options market, just to recap what you have done, okay? So you must have looked at different option classes. So you looked at that there are 2 main option classes. What are the option classes that you looked at in the chat? So these options, we know that they can be traded in the over-the-counter market, as well as they can be traded on the exchange. So if you look at the option classes, what are the 2 main option classes that you know? Option is what? Option will give you the right to buy or sell a particular asset at a certain date in the future for a certain price, right? So there are 2 main option classes that you have learned. One is a call option, yes. So one is a call option and the other one is a put option. So in these option classes, you know that there are 2 option positions that you can take in each of these option classes. One is a long position and the other one is a short position. So even in a put option, you can take a long position and also you can take a short position as well. So what is a call option? Call option will give you the right to buy a particular asset in the future at a certain price. And put option will give you a right to sell a particular asset in the future at a certain price. So what is meant by the long position? So you can take a long position in a call option, or you can take a long position in a put option. So what do you mean by that? Long position, we refer to the option holder's perspective, that you buy it. So from the buyer's perspective, so if you buy it, if you buy the right to buy, or if you buy the right to sell, we call it a long position, right? So the one who buys the option, who buys the right. So the right can be either to a buying right or a selling right. And then short position is what? Short position, we refer to the seller of the option or the writer of the option who sells this right. So here you can refer to, if you look at all four, you can refer to four option positions. One is long position in a call, long position in a put, a short position in a call, and a short position in a put. So, and also here in mechanics of options market, you would have also looked at the payoff.